July the 13th, 1990, Lenin Peak, Soviet Union. At 9:30 in the evening, an earthquake that nobody on the mountain even felt dislodged a wall of ice the size of a city block. It buried 43 climbers in seconds. Nobody at the camps below knew a thing. Not until morning. Not on Everest, not in the Himalaya. Leonid Troshchinenko and his team from the Leningrad Mountaineering Club had done things most climbers only read about. 2 years before this night, he led a team up this exact mountain in the dead of January, in temperatures of negative 45 degrees Celsius. Most of the team turned back. 6 of them reached the summit. Nobody had ever done that in winter before. In the Soviet Union, the highest honor a mountaineer could earn required summiting all 5 of the USSR's 7,000-meter peaks. They called it the Snow Leopard. But Troshchinenko never came back. Neither did 42 of the people sleeping in that camp with him. The part that bothers me with this story is it was not just one mistake, it was a chain, and almost no one in the Western world ever knew it happened. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. To understand why this story matters, you first need to understand where it happened. Lenin Peak sits on the border between what is now Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, deep in the Pamir Mountains of Central Asia. At 7,134 meters, it is taller than any mountain in North America, taller than anything in Europe, taller than anything in Africa. And yet, among the world's serious mountaineers, Lenin Peak carries a very particular reputation. They call it the easiest 7,000-meter mountain on Earth. No steep rock faces, no extreme ice sections. The standard route to the top is essentially a very long, very cold walk. That reputation brought hundreds of climbers here every summer, and for decades, the mountain mostly cooperated. The Soviets had turned it into an international mountaineering institution. They ran it like a campus. Every July, teams from across the Soviet Union and beyond would make the journey to base camp at a place called Achik Tosh, a high valley of yak pastures and glacial streams, sitting at roughly 3,600 meters. To give you a sense of what these people were doing, the standard route to the summit gains 4,500 meters of elevation from base camp. That is like climbing the Empire State Building from street level to roof approximately 16 times, back to back, just to reach the top, in temperatures that can kill exposed skin in minutes, carrying everything you need to survive. And honestly, when you look at what Troshchinenko's people had already done on mountains like this, you would probably understand why the other climbers on the mountain that summer felt completely safe. These were not tourists. These were snow leopards. These were the best. How does the best mountaineering club in the Soviet Union end up at the bottom of a pile of glacial ice? Very simple. The answer starts long before July the 13th, 1990. For Soviet climbers, mountaineering was not just a sport, it was a state institution. The government funded it, the government tracked it. The country produced some of the most accomplished alpinists in history, people who climbed routes in the Pamirs and the Tian Shan that the rest of the world did not even know existed. The Leningrad Mountaineering Club was one of the most decorated institutions in all of Soviet alpine history. To hold a membership card was to belong to an elite. Leonid Troshchinenko was the man who built that club into something formidable. He was not just a good climber, he was a record setter. In January 1988, he led 19 climbers onto Lenin Peak in the middle of winter, with temperatures that dropped to negative 45 degrees Celsius. Only 6 of them had the physical and mental resources to reach the summit. Nobody had stood on a 7,000-meter peak in winter conditions like that before. That kind of thing earns a name. But the summer of 1990 was different in one important way. The Soviet Union was cracking open. Under Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of perestroika, foreigners who had never been permitted inside the USSR were suddenly getting climbing permits. The Pamir International Mountaineering Camp, which the Soviets had hosted annually since 1974, was more international than it had ever been. The 4 Israelis climbing that summer were only the second expedition from their country ever allowed onto a Soviet mountain. Climbers came from Czechoslovakia, from Switzerland, from Germany, from Spain, from Italy. 140 climbers in total were on Lenin Peak that summer, and they all knew the same thing about the mountain they were on. It had a history. 16 years earlier, in 1974, 8 Soviet women had been trapped by a catastrophic storm near the summit of this exact mountain. They died of exposure at 7,000 meters, while rescue teams below could do nothing but listen to their radio transmissions until the voices stopped. Lenin Peak had already taken lives. And still, people came. Because the mountain was the easiest. Because the mountain was safe. Because it always had been. Camp 2 on Lenin Peak sat at 5,300 meters, roughly halfway up the mountain. To reach it from base camp took about 2 days of climbing, not because the terrain was so difficult, but because the human body needs time at altitude. Climbers on Lenin Peak moved in a deliberate pattern. Go up, come down, sleep low, go up again. Let the blood thicken. Let the lungs slowly learn to pull what they need from thinner air. Camp 2 had a nickname that every climber on the mountain knew. They called it the frying pan. It earned that name from the shape of the terrain. The camp sat on a broad, flat plateau, a gently sloping expanse of packed snow, surrounded on 3 sides by rising ridges. From below, it looked sheltered, protected even. For decades, hundreds of climbers had rested there without incident, boiled water on small stoves, patched their gear, slept well before the push to Camp 3. By the evening of July the 13th, there were roughly 20 tents on that plateau, 45 climbers, 6 nations. The days leading up to this night had been difficult. It had been snowing on and off for most of the week. The soft, fresh snow made every step harder than it should have been. Progress up the mountain was slow, but the mood in camp was not grim. It never is in those early days of a summit push. There is a particular warmth that forms between strangers at high altitude. You are all fighting the same thin air, all eating the same terrible food, all lying in the same cramped tents, staring at the same green nylon ceiling. The climbers here had been doing exactly that for days. The Leningrad Club members, 23 of them, occupied much of the main area of the frying pan. They were preparing to push for Camp 3 the next day. Among them was Vladimir Voronin, one of the most experienced men on the mountain. There was Alexei Korin, whose tent sat at the far edge of the camp. And there was Miroslav Brozman, a 22-year-old from what was then Czechoslovakia, who was in his tent with his 2 best friends from childhood, Vlad and Brano. The 3 of them had grown up together in a small town in central Slovakia. They had climbed together since they were teenagers. They had been selected for this expedition just a few months earlier. Vladimir Baliberdin, one of the most decorated Soviet mountaineers alive, a man who had already stood on the summit of Everest, made a quiet decision that afternoon to push further up to Camp 3 rather than spend another night in the frying pan. It seemed like nothing, just impatience, just ambition. 6 climbers from Britain had set up their tents slightly apart from the main cluster, at the edge of the plateau. Nobody thought anything of these small choices. By 9 in the evening, the camp was settling in. Water was being boiled for tea. Extra layers were being pulled on. Sleeping bags were being unzipped and rezipped. The summit felt close. The worst of the acclimatization was behind them. The road above was well-traveled, well understood. Life was quite simply perfect. 216 kilometers below the surface of the earth, directly beneath the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan, something was moving. July the 13th. A Friday the 13th. For the people in those tents, that detail meant nothing. What mattered was that it had been snowing for days. The plateau of the frying pan was loaded with fresh, unstable snow. Week after week of snowfall had layered the slopes above, with more material than they had held in a long time. The ridges and ice faces that surrounded the camp had been quietly accumulating weight that nobody could see from below. None of the 45 climbers at Camp 2 knew that Lenin Peak had a neighbor with a problem. Just over the ridge, on the slopes of a nearby peak called Chapayev, sat a serac, a building-sized column of glacial ice. It had been sitting there for a very long time, held in place by the same cold that had always held it. Below it, 1,000 meters of slope fed directly down toward the frying pan. At Camp 1, Roughly 1,000 meters below Camp 2, climbers were settling in for the night. They had no way of seeing what was happening above them. The glacier between the camps absorbed sound. No radio call was scheduled. There was nothing to make anyone look up. And here is the detail that will sit with you. The earthquake that caused everything that night was a 6.4 magnitude event, significant enough to move buildings. The kind of earthquake that gets reported on the news. It originated 216 kilometers underground, directly beneath the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan. But the shock traveled through so much rock and so much ice that by the time it reached Lenin Peak, the glacier absorbed it completely. Not a tremor, not a vibration, nothing. The climbers in their tents felt nothing. The climbers at Camp 1 felt nothing. No alarms, no signals, no sound in the snow that would tell anyone that 500 meters above their heads, a column of ice the size of a building had just let go. At 9:30 in the evening, the Serac on Chapayev began to fall. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what a Serac actually is. A Serac is a column of glacial ice. Glaciers are not static. They flow slowly and constantly, pulled downhill by their own enormous weight. As a glacier flows, it bends and cracks. Where the ice cracks and refreezes over and over, huge columns form, sometimes 10 meters tall, sometimes 30, sometimes more. That is a Serac. They are not rare. They exist on most glaciated mountains in the world. What makes them dangerous is that they are enormous blocks of frozen water, sitting on steep slopes, held in place only by cold temperature and pressure. When either of those changes, the Serac moved. The Serac on Chapayev Peak was not on any route description. It was not something the climbers at Camp 2 had thought about. It sat above them and to the side, on a neighboring summit, held in place by the same permanent cold that had held it for generations. The 6.4 earthquake was enough. Just enough. The Serac detached and tumbled down the face of Chapayev. As it fell, it broke apart. Breaking apart meant sending ice and snow cascading across the slopes in every direction. Loose material on a steep slope becomes an avalanche within seconds, and the slope above the frying pan was already loaded with weeks of fresh snow. What resulted was, by eyewitness accounts from climbers watching from below, nearly 300 meters wide. For reference, that is roughly the length of 3 full soccer fields placed side by side, all moving at once. One witness described it as looking like a billowing cloud rolling downhill in slow motion. But there was nothing slow about it. It was gathering mass and speed with every meter it descended. The frying pan, that broad, flat, seemingly safe plateau, sat directly in its path with nowhere to run. Quick heads up. Every week I drop new videos you will not find anywhere else. Please subscribe. 9:30 p.m. A low rumble. From below, climbers at Camp 1 bolt upright in their tents. From the British team's bivouac just short of Camp 2, men tear their tent zippers open and look up the slope. The entire ridge above Camp 2 has let loose. A wall of white, 300 meters wide and close to a mile in length, is rolling downhill. Fast. At Camp 2, they can see it coming. Climbers run in every direction. 45 people in the path of something 300 meters across with no room to escape. The avalanche is too wide. It does not matter which way you run. It hits the camp in seconds. Tents disappear, equipment disappears, the trail through the camp disappears. The entire plateau is replaced instantly by a flat expanse of compressed snow and glacial ice. One moment, 20 tents. The next, nothing. Camp 2 has been erased. 2 people survive. Alexei Koren was at the edge of the camp. Miroslav Brozman was also at the edge. The wave buries both of them, but not completely. They claw their way to the surface. Koren has a broken arm. Brozman has a broken leg. His 2 friends from childhood, Vlad and Brano, who were in the same tent with him moments ago, are gone. They emerge into the dark. Sleeping clothes, 5,300 meters, no gear. And beneath them, beneath a hardening layer of glacial debris, they can hear voices. Their companions, still alive under the snow, calling out. Korin and Brosman dig with their hands. They dig until the debris is no longer snow. The ice has set like concrete. The voices continue for hours, and then they stop. With a broken arm and a broken leg between them, Korin and Brosman begin the descent. 1,000 meters down to Camp 1, in the dark, in sleeping clothes, at altitude. At times, the fog was so thick that Alexei could not tell whether the terrain in front of him went up or down. He would throw a snowball and listen for the impact. Then he would descend a short distance, climb back up, and drag Miro down on top of a sleeping pad. Miro could not walk. He crawled. At Camp 1, a witness remembered one of them stumbling in. The words were simple. They are all dead. That was the moment the world found out. Not in the seconds after the avalanche, not in the hours, but when two broken men reached a camp 1,000 meters below, sometime long after midnight, in the cold, in the dark. That is what nobody knew until morning actually means. Rescue teams reached the site at first light. A small group of 4 descended to the camp with shovels. Soviet helicopters were mobilized. Rescuers dug with bare hands into the debris field. The ice had hardened completely. It had become, in practical terms, a wall. Only one body was recovered from the site. The other 42 remained inside the mountain. They are there still, for the most part. In 2004, glacial melt brought partial remains to the surface at 4,200 meters. More emerged in 2008. A plaque at the Achiktosh base camp carries 43 names. When you lay the facts in sequence, a terrifying picture begins to form. There was not one cause, there were 5, and they lined up perfectly. The first was the mountain's reputation. Lenin Peak was known as the easiest 7,000-meter peak in the world. That reputation brought 140 climbers there that summer, and it brought them with a level of trust in the terrain that reduced caution. The danger nobody planned for was the danger that came from a neighboring peak, not the one they were climbing. The second was the geography of the frying pan. The broad, flat plateau felt like shelter. It was surrounded by gentle ridges, which looked like protection, but there was no exit. No angle of escape from anything coming down the slope above. The same geography that made it feel safe was the same geography that made it a trap. The third was the earthquake's depth. At 216 kilometers underground, the tremor was too far below the surface to be felt at altitude. The glacier absorbed the shaking completely. No one had any warning. No one had any reason to move. The fourth was the snowfall. Days of fresh snow had loaded the slopes around Chapayev Peak beyond what they had held in years. When the Serac fell, it did not simply start a small slide. It triggered a slope already primed to collapse. The fifth was concentration. 45 climbers in one location. The few who survived did so because of small, random, almost meaningless choices made hours earlier. Baliberdine pushed to Camp 3. The British team camped apart. Korin and Brosman were at the edge rather than the center. Psychologists call this the Swiss cheese model. Every layer of protection had a hole in it. On July the 13th, 1990, all the holes lined up at once. Alexei Korin still climbs. He returned to Lenin Peak after the disaster. He walked past the plaque. He looked up at the slope. And when asked about the danger, he said this: "It was the only avalanche in 70 years. There is no way it will repeat itself. I do not think so." 43 climbers died because the mountain they trusted, the easiest 7,000-meter peak in the world, had been building a secret underground for decades, and nobody knew until morning. Not one of those 43 people did anything wrong. There is no lesson that would have saved them. The mountain just moved. Leave me a comment below. Does a story like this change whether you would ever climb at altitude? I want to know.